Welcome to this episode. Today we are telling the story of a man who may well be among the most unjustly forgotten classical composers in the history of Western music. His name is Orlando di Lasso, or depending on where you stood in Renaissance Europe, Orlando di Lassus, Roland de Lassus, or simply Orlando. He was born around 1532 in the city of Mons, in what is now Belgium, and he died on the 14th of June, 1594 in Munich. He was kidnapped 3 times as a child for the beauty of his voice. He became choir director of one of the most important churches in Christendom before the age of 21. He was knighted by a pope and ennobled by an emperor. He composed more than 1,350 works, some sources count over 2,000, in 4 languages across every major musical genre of his time. He was the most published composer of the 16th century by a very wide margin. And yet today, many people who love classical music cannot tell you a single thing about him. That is what this episode is here to change. We will follow Orlando di Lasso from his troubled childhood in Mons through his formative years in Italy, across the courts and printing houses of Europe, and into the remarkable final chapter of his life in Bavaria. We will explore what made him great, what made him human, and why his music still speaks to us, with a clarity, a humor, and a depth that 400 years have not diminished. Chapter 1, Childhood and Youth. To understand Orlando di Lasso, you have to start with the city where he was born. Mons, in the county of Hainaut, was a prosperous trading town sitting on the border between the French-speaking and Flemish-speaking worlds. In the early 16th century, it belonged to the vast Habsburg Empire of Charles V, making it a place where Spanish power, Flemish culture, and French language all met and mingled. That border-crossing quality, the ease of moving between languages, styles, and worlds, would become the defining trait of the man who grew up there. The exact year of his birth is uncertain. Most scholars settle on around 1532, though some sources suggest 1530. His family name was almost certainly de Lattre, not Lasso. The name by which we know him, Lasso in Italian, Lassus in Latin, was adopted later, probably in Italy, and it may have been a deliberate reinvention. A 17th century chronicler named Vincent recorded that his father had been condemned for coining false money, a serious crime, a public shame. Whether this story is entirely accurate is debated, but what it suggests is a childhood touched by social precariousness and the need to become someone new. The young Lasso was enrolled as a choir boy at the Church of St. Nicholas in Mons. The cathedral choir boy system was the Renaissance equivalent of a music conservatory. Boys with exceptional voices were trained intensively in singing, Latin, counterpoint, and liturgical practice. What was not normal was what happened to Lasso next. His voice was so spectacularly beautiful that he became quite literally a target. According to the personal testimony of Samuel Quickelberg, a scholar who knew Lasso closely in later life and wrote one of the earliest biographical accounts of him, the boy was kidnapped 3 times before the age of 12. 3 times. Someone with money and power decided that this child's voice was too precious to leave in Mons, and took him. The first 2 times his parents tracked him down and brought him home. The 3rd time, in 1544, the man who came calling was no ordinary opportunist. He was Ferrante Gonzaga, Viceroy of Sicily, and one of the most powerful military commanders in the imperial army of Charles V. This time, Lasso's parents gave their consent. The 12-year-old boy left Mons and never really came back. We should pause here because it is easy to read this story through modern eyes and feel only horror. And yes, there is something disturbing about a system in which talented children were routinely removed from their families and circulated through a network of aristocratic and ecclesiastical patrons. But for a family of limited means, placing a gifted son in the household of a great nobleman was an opportunity for education, for career, for advancement. Ferrante Gonzaga was a cultivated Renaissance nobleman who genuinely appreciated music and who gave Lasso access to a world he could never have reached from Mons. The journey that followed was, by any standard, extraordinary. Gonzaga's household moved through France, he was on military campaign, and then south through Italy, to Mantua, where the Gonzaga family held one of Europe's most prestigious courts, then to Palermo in Sicily, then to Milan, where Gonzaga was governor. For a teenager from a small Belgian city, this was an immersion in the most sophisticated culture Europe had to offer. The courts of northern Italy in the mid-16th century were the centers of everything: art, poetry, music, philosophy, fashion, and power. Lasso absorbed it all. In Milan, scholars believe he encountered the madrigalist spiritualoso da Reggio, whose light-textured, text-sensitive Italian madrigal style left a mark on the young Lasso's developing musical sensibility. The Italian madrigal was the great secular art form of the age, intimate, expressive, preoccupied with poetry and emotion, and Lasso took to it naturally. He was already showing the quality that would define his entire career: an ability to enter any musical language and speak it as a native. From Milan around 1549, the household moved again, and Lasso found himself in Naples. This time more independently, working as a singer and beginning composer for the Neapolitan nobleman Costantino Castriotto. Naples was something else entirely. It was loud, carnivalesque, cosmopolitan, a port city that mixed Spanish aristocratic culture with Italian street vitality. Here Lasso encountered a different kind of music: the villanella, the moresca, the popular dialect song, raucous, earthy, packed with wordplay and double entendre. He loved it. He would keep writing this kind of music for the rest of his life, even from the most prestigious, sacred positions in Europe. A fact that tells you a great deal about who he was. Chapter 2. Life and Career. Around 1552, Lasso moved to Rome and entered the service of Cosimo I de' Medici. By 1553, when he was perhaps 21 years old, he was appointed choir director of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, the mother church of all Christendom. The position was one of the most prestigious musical posts in the world, and he was barely old enough to grow a full beard. Rome in these years was also where Lasso almost certainly encountered Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. Palestrina was working at the nearby Cappella Giulia, the choir of St. Peter's Basilica, and the two young maestri occupied parallel positions at the apex of Roman church music. Lasso held the Lateran post, Palestrina held the Giulia. They were contemporaries, probably acquaintances, possibly friends. Palestrina would later succeed Lasso at the Lateran. The mutual influence between these two figures is debated by scholars, but their parallel early careers in Rome, in the same decade, in the same city, is a fact, and it is one of the most fascinating collisions of genius in music history. But the Roman period was cut short by personal tragedy. In 1554, news reached Lasso that his parents back in Mons were gravely ill. He resigned his post, packed his things, and rushed north with all the speed a 16th century traveler could manage. He did not make it in time. Both parents had died before he arrived. He had left Mons as a 12-year-old, taken away for his voice, and now he returned as an adult of 22 to find that the people who had let him go, who had given their consent, who had perhaps trusted that he would see them again, were gone. He never returned to Mons again for the rest of his life. The city of his birth, with its unresolvable mixture of guilt and grief, was too much to revisit. This moment of loss, scholars argue, left a deep imprint on his music. The recurring themes of penitence, guilt, the longing for forgiveness, and the pain of separation that run through his greatest works, the 7 penitential psalms, the Passions, the final Lagrime di San Pietro, may be rooted here in this specific personal failure to return in time. After this grief, Lasso did not immediately return to Italy. Instead, around 1554 to 1555, he traveled to Antwerp, then the commercial capital of Northern Europe and one of its most important centers of music printing. In 1555, with support from the Genoese merchant community in Antwerp, Lasso published his first collection, a landmark anthology mixing madrigals, villanescas, French chansons, and motets. At the same time, his first book of 5-voice madrigals was printed in Venice. He also found a patron of enormous importance in Antoine Perronneau de Granvelle, Cardinal Archbishop of Arras, and one of the most powerful men in Charles V's administration. Lasso dedicated his first motet book to Granvelle, and in the dedication, true to his wit, he embedded a Latin pun on his own name. The phrase reads in Latin, sustain lassum, sustain the weary one, where lassum simultaneously echoes his surname. He was introducing himself to the world with a joke about his own name. That tells you everything about his sense of humor. These publications announced him across Europe as a fully formed genius. Lasso understood something very few musicians of his era grasped. Music publication was not merely about sharing music. It was about building a reputation and reaching patrons across a continent. He left Antwerp in 1556 when something better arrived, an invitation to join the court chapel of Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria in Munich. He arrived in autumn 1556 as a tenor singer, and Munich, transforming itself into a European cultural metropolis, would remain his home for the rest of his life. 2 years after his arrival in 1558, he married Regina Weckinger, the daughter of a maid of honor of the Duchess. It was a socially respectable match, and by all accounts a genuinely loving one. Regina was not a passive background figure. She managed the household with intelligence and determination, wrote letters on her husband's behalf, and in his final illness, she would be the person who fought for him most fiercely. Together, they had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. 2 of those sons, Ferdinand and Rudolf, became accomplished composers in their own right and would later inherit their father's position at the Munich court. A daughter married the court painter Hans von Aachen. The family was embedded in the cultural fabric of Munich. In 1563, Lasso was officially appointed the court's chief musician, taking over from the Flemish composer Ludwig Deser. From this moment, he held absolute authority over one of Europe's finest musical establishments. The chapel would eventually grow to include more than 70 singers, keyboard players, and instrumentalists. The early Munich years produced some of Lasso's most private and spiritually intense music. Around 1560, Duke Albrecht commissioned him to compose the 7 penitential psalms as a devotional work for the Duke's personal use, musica reservata, strictly for the intimacy of the ducal court. Albrecht had the manuscripts illustrated with spectacular full-page miniatures by the court painter Hans Mielig, whose cycle of images commenting on each psalm text turned the whole project into something unprecedented. A total artwork in which music, sacred imagery, and humanist scholarship fused into a single devotional object. The psalms remained unpublished for decades, not appearing in print until 1584, 5 years after Albrecht's death. Through the 1560s and 1570s, Lasso's reputation reached a scale no composer had achieved before. His music was being printed in Venice, Paris, Antwerp, Nuremberg, London, and beyond. At the absolute peak of his fame, in 1569 and 1570, over 20 separate publications containing his music appeared in a single year. Think about what that means in an era before recording technology, before radio, before streaming, before any form of mass media. The only way a composer's music reached people was through printed books, handwritten copies, or live performance. And in those years, Lasso's music was appearing in a new publication almost every 2 weeks, somewhere in Europe. He traveled constantly on behalf of Duke Albrecht, to Flanders to recruit singers, to Venice and Ferrara to scout musicians, to Paris 3 times to visit the court of King Charles IX of France. In Paris, he moved in the circles of the great Pléiade poets, Pierre de Ronsard and Joachim du Bellay, whose French verses he set with extraordinary sensitivity. His French chansons, in honor of this tradition, became the most reprinted secular songs in Europe. And in one of the most delicious ironies of Reformation history, even the Protestant Huguenots, enemies of the Catholic court and everything it represented, found his music irresistible. They stripped the text from his bawdy chansons and replaced them with pious Calvinist verses, using Catholic pop songs as vehicles for Protestant devotion. During a trip to Italy in the mid-1570s, Lasso also encountered the young Giovanni Gabrieli, the composer who would later transform Venetian sacred music with his grand polychoral style at St. Mark's Basilica. Gabrieli came to Munich and studied under Lasso. What he absorbed at the Bavarian court, the textural richness, the dramatic expressivity, the interplay of large vocal forces, fed directly into the grand ceremonial sound that became his signature. Lasso's influence on the generation that created the early Baroque was not merely stylistic, it was personal, informative. The international competition for Lasso's services was intense. King Charles IX of France made a personal attempt to lure him to Paris in 1574. Lasso declined. The Munich court immediately raised his salary from 325 to 400 gulden per year, just to keep him. Then in 1580, the Elector of Saxony offered him the prestigious post of court Kapellmeister in Dresden. Lasso turned it down again. He cited, among other things, his extensive property holdings in Bavaria. A house near the Munich Platzl, a second adjacent house, plots of land in Maisach and Schöngeising. The international superstar had become a genuine Bavarian property owner. His relationship with the young crown prince, the future Duke Wilhelm V, was something altogether different from these formal honors. Through the 1570s, Lasso wrote letters to the prince that are among the most entertaining documents of the entire Renaissance. They are rambling, digressive, multilingual, mixing French, Italian, Latin, and German in the same sentence, stuffed with private jokes, affectionate nicknames, and coded references that scholars still argue about. In one letter, Lasso gleefully reports winning at cards against one of the Duke's courtiers. In another, he complains about court gossip with comic indignation. 43 of these letters survive in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich, and they paint a portrait of a man who was funny, tender, and completely at ease with the most powerful people of his age. Chapter 3, Final Years. In 1579, Duke Albrecht V died, and his son succeeded him as Duke Wilhelm V. The transition changed everything. Albrecht had been a generous, arts-loving patron who gave Lasso enormous creative freedom. Wilhelm was pious, fiscally cautious, and deeply influenced by the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The court's musical establishment, which had swelled to more than 70 musicians, was progressively reduced, but the personal relationship between Lasso and Wilhelm remained warm. Wilhelm retained Lasso at full salary even as the chapel contracted, an act of personal loyalty that went beyond institutional obligation. The great rupture of the early 1580s came not from finances, but from religion. In 1581, Duke Wilhelm imported a Jesuit reformer named Walram Tumler to overhaul the court's worship practices. What Tumler found when he arrived in Munich was, by his own account, shocking. Priests who could barely read the Mass, a choir that raced through the Psalms, vestments that were torn and dirty. And this was perhaps his most contentious demand, musicians who insisted on wearing their swords to Mass. Tumler required that they leave their weapons at the door and wear proper choir robes during processions. Contemporary accounts note that this demand greatly upset the musicians. You can almost hear the grumbling. When Tumler wrote to Rome to complain about the state of the Munich chapel, his Jesuit superior wrote a response in the margin of the letter that has survived in the archives of the Jesuit German College in Rome. The superior wrote, "What more indeed did you expect from singers chosen from rabble? They are more interested in eating and drinking than in the liturgy, and they sell their services to whoever offers more." This is a remarkably candid document, a piece of 16th century institutional complaint that could have been written yesterday about almost any ensemble in any institution. Tumler's reforms had direct and measurable consequences for Lasso's music. Scholars can trace the impact almost month by month. In March 1582, Lasso composed his Passions according to St. Mark and St. Luke. They were performed in April of that year. Comparing them with his earlier Passion settings, the Matthew and John Passions, reveals a dramatic stylistic shift. The florid, emotionally expressive settings, with their elaborate character development and intense text painting, gave way to something stark, stripped back, and text-focused. Almost no ornamentation. The Jesuit theology of simplicity and realism, as embodied in Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, had directly entered the music. Religious and political pressure had left indelible marks on the compositional voice. Around the same time, Duke Wilhelm decreed the Reformed liturgy throughout all of Bavaria, adding, with characteristic counter-Reformation severity, that failure to comply would be punishable by death. Lasso navigated this atmosphere with the flexibility of someone who had spent his whole life moving between courts and cultures. He composed music that satisfied Jesuit austerity for the liturgy while continuing to produce lively secular pieces for court entertainment. The 17 Lasso pieces, placed on a Jesuit prohibited music list in 1591, stand as a curious testament to his range. The same composer whose deeply devout penitential psalms were commissioned as private royal devotion was also the man whose drinking songs attracted official censure. By 1590, the darkness was closing in. Around that year, and the precise date is uncertain, Lasso suffered a catastrophic health collapse. His wife Regina came home one day to find her husband unable to speak and unable to recognize her. A court physician named Thomas Merman was summoned. Some recovery followed, but Lasso never returned to his former self. He suffered from chronic insomnia, lost his ability to work, and, this was perhaps the most striking change to those who knew him, became, in Regina's own words, gloomy and spoke only of death. The man whose letters to Wilhelm had been full of jokes, wordplay, and gambling stories had become someone else entirely. Modern physicians looking at the clinical description, sudden incapacity, inability to speak, failure to recognize his wife, followed by chronic depression and insomnia, would likely diagnose a stroke followed by a prolonged depressive episode. 16th century physicians described it as true melancholy, in excess of black bile. Regina fought fiercely on his behalf, writing letters to former patrons, reminding them of his decades of faithful service and arguing that overwork had destroyed his health. The financial situation was precarious in these final years, and the thought of poverty, after all those years of honors, was real. And yet, out of this darkness, in the final months of his life, came something extraordinary. In 1594, barely weeks before his death, Lasso completed a cycle of 20 sacred madrigals for 7 voices and a concluding Latin motet. He called it Lagrime di San Pietro, the Tears of St. Peter. The texts were by the Neapolitan poet Luigi Tansillo, who had died in 1568. Tansillo's verses depict the inner agony of St. Peter after his threefold denial of Christ, the stages of shame, grief, and desperate longing for forgiveness. It is about guilt. It is about the terrible distance between who we are and who we meant to be. It is about asking for mercy when you are not sure you deserve it. On the 24th of May, 1594, Lasso sent the manuscript to Pope Clement VIII with a dedication letter. He called it his work of personal devotion, Per mia particolare devozione. 3 weeks later, on the 14th of June, 1594, he died in Munich. There is one more detail that haunts this story. According to some accounts, Wilhelm V had decided on that very day, the day Lasso died, to dismiss him from court service due to the financial pressures that had been building for years. Whether this is precisely true or a piece of tragic timing inflated by later storytelling, it carries its own symbolic weight. Lasso was buried in the Franciscan cemetery in Munich. His sons Ferdinand and Rudolf assembled his complete motet output and published it in 1604 under the title Magnum Opus Musicum, the great work of music. As the title promised, it was not an exaggeration. Chapter 4, Musical Development and Historical Impact. To understand what makes Orlando di Lasso exceptional, you need to understand the musical landscape he entered. The dominant tradition of the late Renaissance was what we call the Franco-Flemish school, a style of polyphony that is multi-voice composition developed by generations of composers from the Low Countries and northern France. Names like Guillaume Dufay, Johannes Ockeghem, and Josquin des Prés had built this tradition over the course of the 15th century. It was technically sophisticated, architecturally complex, and above all international. Franco-Flemish composers were the superstar musicians of their era, exported to courts across Europe precisely because of their mastery of this style. Lasso was born into this tradition, he was its heir, and then he went far beyond it. What Lasso did, which no one before him had quite managed, was absorb this tradition completely and then layer on top of it a fluency in every other major musical language of his time. He composed with equal ease in Latin, Italian, French, and German, not merely competently, but with genuine mastery of each language's specific rhythmic character. its text declamation style, its emotional register. Palestrina composed almost exclusively in Latin. Other composers were specialists in Italian or French. Lasso was all of them, simultaneously. This four-language mastery was not merely technical facility. Latin carried the weight of sacred ceremony and humanist gravitas. Italian was the language of erotic wit, dramatic surprise, and lyrical warmth. French was the language of elegance, wordplay, and courtly refinement. German was the language of directness, communal feeling, and popular appeal. Lasso moved between all four with the ease of a natural polyglot. The technique for which he is most celebrated is text painting. The music illustrates and interprets the emotional meaning of the words being sung. When a text speaks of pain, Lasso writes dissonant harmonies that sting. When it speaks of flight, the melodic lines run quickly upward. When it speaks of death, the music slows and darkens. Lasso practiced this with a consistency, subtlety, and dramatic intelligence that set him apart. Notably, in his passion settings, he consistently ends text sections containing a question with a raised melodic pitch, imitating the natural upward inflection of the spoken voice. This is one of the earliest systematic instances of speech prosody being encoded directly into polyphonic notation. In those same passion settings, Lasso created something even more striking: sustained musical characterization across the narrative arc. Peter's growing terror is shown through increasingly agitated melodic figuration, longer melismas, more text repetition, a sense of mounting desperation. Judas's guilt is marked by a change in vocal texture and a resolution denied to other characters. The chief priests who condemn Jesus are portrayed with almost no dramatic treatment at all, sparse, emotionless, cold, following Christ's own words about whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but hollow within. This kind of sustained dramatic characterization would not reappear with such consistency until the operas of Monteverdi. Among his most experimental works, the Prophetiae Sibyllorum, the Prophecies of the Sibyls, stands apart. This cycle of 12 motets, composed probably in the late 1550s but not published until after his death, uses chromaticism that pushes Renaissance harmony to its absolute limit. Semitone shifts and unexpected chord progressions produce colors that sound almost like early 20th century music. Classified as musica reservata, it was private court music not intended for public performance. Lasso was using the aristocratic patronage system's privacy as a laboratory for ideas too radical for wider audiences. This concept of musica reservata, reserved music for exclusive audiences, was one of the defining intellectual frameworks of late Renaissance musical culture. It was connected to the broader humanist project of recreating the legendary ethical power of ancient Greek music through an intimate union of text and sound. Lasso was one of the leading practitioners of this idea, and the 7 penitential psalms belong to it as much as the Prophetiae Sibyllorum. Both represent music written not for the church, not for the marketplace, but for a single listener in a private room, seeking an experience of depth that public music could not provide. The secular output is equally remarkable. His French chanson, Je l'aime bien, survived in 31 known prints. His setting of Suzanne un jour appeared in 28 prints, plus 22 tablature arrangements for solo instruments. These are numbers comparable in their cultural reach to a modern chart-topping song. Alongside these popular hits, he wrote raucous drinking songs and comic parodies of liturgical music. One motet, Furtur in Convivis, includes the line, in Latin, "And more than the church do I love the tavern." Lasso saw no contradiction between sublime sacred polyphony and writing about preferring a tavern to a church. Both were aspects of human experience. He also embedded his own name into his music. The solmization system of the Renaissance used syllable names for the 6 notes of the hexachord: ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Lasso's name begins with la. A descending major second, la followed by sol, appears repeatedly in works associated with him and in tributes by other composers. This La Sol signature became his personal musical monogram, a calling card recognized across Europe. The Flemish composer John Turnhout, in a 1589 madrigal collection dedicated to the governor of the Netherlands, opened several pieces by quoting this La Sol figure from Lasso's own compositions, what scholars describe as a modest bow to the divine Lasso. In his first motet book, published in Antwerp in 1556, Lasso opened the collection with a motet whose Latin text contains the phrase Muserum famulum ne despice, sustain lassum, do not despise the servant of the Muses, sustain the weary one. The word lassum, meaning the weary one, is simultaneously a pun on his surname, and he placed his La Sol musical signature in the music at exactly that word. A man who could make a joke out of his own dedication letter is a man with a very specific kind of confidence. One of the most amusing accidents in all of Lasso's publishing history involved his drinking song Fairtur in Convivii, which the publishers Leroy and Ballard printed in 1576, alongside a satirical funeral lament for the composer Clemens non-papa. This was clearly meant as a joke, but Huguenot publishers, apparently unfamiliar with the satirical intent, adopted the funeral text as sincere sacred devotion and reprinted it in Protestant hymn books. A drinking song parody thus became, through a chain of misunderstandings, a piece of devout Protestant sacred music. Sacred and profane had become hopelessly entangled, which is, in its way, a perfect metaphor for Lasso's entire output. What did his contemporaries say about him? The music theorist Michael Pretorius, writing in the early 17th century, declared that Lasso's motets represented the epitome of the genre for his entire era. The composer Jean de Castro systematically arranged Lasso's 4 to 6 voice motets as 3-voice pieces in the 1570s as a form of compositional apprenticeship, treating Lasso's output as a supreme pedagogical textbook. Johann Sebastian Bach, a century later, studied and transcribed the motets. The penitential psalms were being performed in Bavarian churches well into the 19th century, and yet today, when people speak of Renaissance polyphony, the name that comes to mind is almost always Palestrina, not Lasso. Scholars have long noted this imbalance. In his own lifetime, Lasso was far more famous, more printed, and more widely performed than Palestrina. The overshadowing happened gradually, for reasons that are partly linguistic. Palestrina composed almost exclusively in Latin, making his output accessible to anyone with a Catholic musical education. Lasso composed in 4 languages, and to fully appreciate the wit of his French chansons, the dramatic charge of his Italian madrigals, and the earthiness of his German songs, you need to meet him on his own multilingual terms. For centuries, that was too much to ask of most listeners and scholars. Only in the late 20th century did his reputation begin to recover the ground it had lost. Chapter 5, Life Apart from Music. Every piece of surviving personal evidence about Orlando di Lasso points to the same picture: a man of irrepressible humor, verbal dexterity, and warm human connection. The letters to Duke Wilhelm V are extraordinary documents. They are multilingual, punning, self-deprecating, gossipy, and full of private jokes that scholars still attempt to decode. Lasso addresses the prince in terms of playful affection, using nicknames and coded references that suggest genuine intimacy rather than mere courtly performance. He describes winning at cards. He complains about weather and travel and court gossip. He plays with his own name, writing once of being Lasso ma di buon cor, weary but of good cheer. In Italian, Lasso means tired. It is both his name and a constant, gently self-mocking pun on his own condition. Beyond the letters, the picture of his daily life is one of comfortable, rooted domesticity. He was proud of his property. He tended a garden. He gambled, and apparently won more often than he lost. He ate and drank well. The Jesuit superior's complaint that his musicians were more interested in eating and drinking than in the liturgy almost certainly captured something of the general atmosphere of the Munich court chapel, which Lasso ran. He was physically present and convivial, a man who belonged at a table with friends, not in solitary retreat. His marriage to Regina was, by all available evidence, a genuine partnership. They had 6 children together over a span of years, and the household was large and lively. In his final illness, it was Regina who took charge, writing to patrons, managing finances, describing her husband's condition in letters that remain the primary clinical source for what happened to him. Her voice in those letters is sharp, worried, and proud. She does not ask for charity. She demands recognition of what Lasso had given to the court. His relationship to religion is the most complex dimension of his personality, and it has puzzled scholars for generations. Lasso was a lifelong Roman Catholic whose sacred music, the penitential psalms, the Passions, the Propitius Sibilarum, the Lagrime de San Pietro, is among the most spiritually profound and sincerely devotional music of the 16th century. These are the works of a man who genuinely grappled with faith, guilt, and the hope of divine mercy. And yet this same man wrote drinking songs that parodied the liturgy, set texts celebrating the tavern over the church, composed masses based on the musical material of secular and even erotic chansons, and packed his Italian secular works with obscene wordplay. The Jesuit provincial of Bavaria placed 17 of his pieces on a prohibited music list in 1591. The Huguenots were using his bawdy chansons as devotional prayer material. Both things were true at once. The most persuasive scholarly argument is that Lasso operated within a clear Renaissance distinction between the secular and the genuinely profane. The secular was a shared human space, bawdy, earthy, comic, that Christian culture could contain and even redeem. Only the genuinely anti-sacred, the directly blasphemous, was truly off limits, and Lasso never crossed that line. Moreover, the practice of basing sacred works, masses, magnificats, on secular musical material was entirely standard in Renaissance musical culture. It was understood as artistic elevation, taking worldly material and spiritually ennobling it by placing it in a sacred context. Lasso was one of the greatest practitioners of this technique, having composed roughly 100 Magnificat settings, many of them based on secular source material, including love songs and dance music. In his final years, the religious dimension became intensely personal. The Lagrime de San Pietro is not a commissioned work of devotion. It is a dying man's meditation on guilt and the hope of forgiveness. Peter had failed his Lord at the moment that mattered most. Lasso had failed his parents at the moment that mattered most. The parallel is not something scholars need to argue for. It is there in every bar of the music. In one of the madrigals in the Lagrim cycle, there is a Latin phrase embedded in the text, sedisti lassus, you sat down, weary. The word lassus in Latin means tired or exhausted. It is also Lasso's own name. Scholars have pointed out that this moment, a dying composer embedding his own name into a prayer addressed to Christ, asking for mercy, is perhaps the most intimate moment in all his music. It is a man saying, I am here, I am tired, I am named for weariness. Please do not forget me. Chapter 6. Where to find him today? One of the most significant facts about Orlando di Lasso's legacy is that the complete scholarly edition of his works, the project of establishing, editing, and publishing every surviving composition in an authoritative form, was only finished in 2021. Not 1921, not 1821, 2021. 427 years after his death. That is how long it took to fully grasp the scale of what he left behind. The institution responsible for completing this monumental task is the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Munich. The Academy's Orlando di Lasso Complete Edition, known in German as the Gesamtausgabe, was initiated in the 1890s by Franz Xaver Haberl and Adolf Sandberger, paused due to financial and wartime interruptions, and relaunched in 1956. The new complete edition, published in collaboration with Bärenreiter and Kassel, comprises 26 volumes and was completed in the mid-1990s. The revised old edition was finally wrapped up in 2021. The Bavarian State Library in Munich holds some of the most important Lasso primary sources in the world. Among them is the Mielich Codex, the illuminated manuscript of the 7 penitential psalms painted by the court artist Hans Mielich, combining a musical score with a full cycle of miniature paintings illustrating each psalm. Many of these manuscripts are now digitally accessible through the library's online collections. The music publisher Bärenreiter in Kassel continues to publish individual volumes of Lasso's works as performance editions, making his scores available for choirs and ensembles worldwide. Breitkopf and Hertel in Leipzig issued significant portions of the older complete edition, and Karas Verlag in Stuttgart offers editions specifically designed for choral practitioners. In Mons, the Belgian city where Lasso was born, the composer is commemorated with a monument in the architectural complex called the Cantoria. Mons was designated a European Capital of Culture in 2015, and that occasion prompted significant programming dedicated to his music and legacy. For those who want to hear his music performed live, the landscape is rich. Specialist early music ensembles across Europe and beyond have made Lasso central to their repertoire. The Huelgas Ensemble under Paul Van Nevel has recorded major portions of his work, including the Lagrime di San Pietro, with a scholarly and artistic depth that is hard to surpass. The Ensemble La Tempête under Simon-Pierre Bestion released a recording in 2024 called Orlando, a melancholic portrait, which approaches Lasso's music with great freedom of instrumentation and timbre, projecting his work into the 21st century. The Hilliard Ensemble, Profeti della Quinta, and the Ensemble Vocal European under Philippe Herovega have all made significant contributions to the Lasso discography. For listeners just beginning to explore his output, the Lagrime di San Pietro is the natural starting point, a work of devastating emotional power and remarkable musical coherence that can be heard in a single sitting. Universities and conservatories where Lasso's work forms part of serious musicological and performance study include Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, the Ludwig Maximilians Universität Munich, and the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis in Basel, the leading European training center for historical performance practice. The standard English language scholarly survey is Orlando di Lasso Studies, edited by Peter Bergquist and published by Cambridge University Press in 1999. Lasso's music has also reached the world of film. In 1974, the German director Werner Herzog used his Requiem A5 as part of the soundtrack for The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, a film about a young man who appeared in Nuremberg in 1828 with no memory and no language. The film won the Grand Jury Prize at Cannes. More recently, in 2022, the French-Belgian documentary director Joachim Thome produced a 56-minute film simply called Orlando di Lasso, A Composer's Life in the Renaissance, broadcast on RTE and combining music and narrative to tell the story of his life. The Ensemble La Tempête's 2024 album, Orlando, grew directly out of that documentary project. One particularly meaningful tribute to Lasso's legacy connects his name directly to the living world of music education. In 2006, the Rotary Club München International founded the Orlandus Lasses Stiftung, the Orlandus Lasses Foundation, in Munich. The foundation's purpose is the support of highly gifted music students at the Munich University of Music and Theatre who are in financial need. Its goal is to help young musicians in both their artistic development and their broader role in society. The choice of Orlando di Lasso as the foundation's namesake was deliberate. As an internationally active musician and cultural mediator who crossed languages, borders, and social worlds throughout his life, Lasso represents a particular inspiration for an institution devoted to nurturing the next generation of musical talent. In Munich today, Lasso is also honored with a bronze statue on the Promenadenplatz, which in one of the more amusing footnotes to musical history is simultaneously adorned by fans of Michael Jackson with song lyrics, candles, and flowers. A curious kinship between the Prince of Music and the King of Pop. Summary: Orlando di Lasso was born around 1532 in Mons, kidnapped 3 times as a child, and carried by circumstances into a life of extraordinary breadth, across Naples, Rome, Antwerp, and finally Munich, where he spent the last 38 years of his life. He composed more than 1,350 works in 4 languages, across every major vocal genre of his time. He was the most published composer of the 16th century, recognized by popes and emperors, and known across Europe from the courts of France to the choirs of Protestant Germany. He was also a man who loved gambling, a garden, and good company, who wrote obscene jokes and sublime prayer with equal care, who embedded his own name in dedications and dying prayers alike, who lost his parents to distance and guilt, and spent the rest of his life writing music about penitence and the hope of forgiveness. He died on the 14th of June, 1594, days after sending his final masterwork to Rome, in a city that had become the only home he ever truly chose. His music is not difficult to love. It is generous, humane, witty, and moving. It asks only that you meet it in the language it speaks, and it speaks many. The best you can do is begin somewhere, with the Lagrime de San Pietro, perhaps, or the Penitential Psalms, or one of his comic drinking songs, and let the music do what it has always done. If this episode has opened a door into that world, it has done what it set out to do. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and take a moment to rate the podcast. It really helps us.